Good day, everyone. I'm back again. Whether you like it or not, I just keep coming up with more and more and more lectures. Don't blame me, you signed up for the course. Today, Judaism, Christianity, and cross-cultural exchanges on the Silk Roads. Before we get past this, and I do love this work of art here, depicting some of the urban cultural life along the Silk Roads. But something that needs to be pointed out so people aren't confused, or we can at least lessen the confusion. Much of this unit on Christianity was dealt with in our textbook, in the chapter on the Roman Empire, which we covered in our last PowerPoint lecture and unit. But a little bit of it is covered in the chapter on the cross-cultural exchange and Silk Roads. But the Judaism part of it, which we're going to start with, takes us back to an earlier chapter. Just go back and look up the word Hebrews with an H and find the 4 pages or so that are there. If you haven't read them already, read them again, because this is going to be on the exam. I always do this. Judaism and Christianity go together in ways that we may already know, in ways that we may not already know, you might not already know, but that's why we're here. So Judaism, Christianity, and cross-cultural exchange on the Silk Roads. And Judaism takes us way back. So we're actually jumping back in time somewhat again so we can catch up. Judaism and Christianity, as two of the most influential religions in the Western world, they go together, as I said, in many, many ways. And we've already looked at the Greeks and the Romans, and what becomes Europe, at least a conscious cultural sort of feeling of togetherness amongst different European kingdoms, eventually states, comes mostly from either and or the both, I guess, the Greco-Roman tradition. So remember, Greek and Roman culture are very much related, and they were fused in many ways. And the same then is true of what's called Judeo-Christian culture. So what we call Western civilization or European society is made up of those two strands. There's a Germanic strand too, which we'll skip, but the Greco-Roman tradition feeds into Europe, which we're going to get to when we get to the Middle Ages later in our class, in the last month here, and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Both of those kind of fuse together with the other two. So this is why we need to go back to the Hebrews, and why I like to deal with the history of the Hebrews Israelites, or what we're now dealing with, or dealing with, is what becomes the history of the Jews, together in the same unit, because the religions are so much related to each other. As Paul Johnson, a gifted British intellectual who wrote a magnificent long volume on the history of the Jews, as he did on the history of Christianity as well, says, "No people has ever insisted more firmly than the Jews that history has a purpose and humanity a destiny. At a very early stage in their collective existence, they believed they had detected a divine scheme for the human race, of which their own society was to be the pilot." Kind of like the test case. The Jews stand right at the center of the perennial attempt to give human life the dignity of a purpose. And not surprisingly well said by Paul Johnson, but it's more well said than you may realize. And we might have a chance to get back to this comment, at least indirectly. As far as the course of Hebrew history is concerned, or ancient Jewish history is concerned, this is made known to us primarily through the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, which brings us to our first connection between Judaism and Christianity, the Jews and the Christians, and that is they both share the same Bible, or at least partially share the same Bible, since Christianity draws from both the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's some slight differences in the Jewish and the Christian Old Testaments, but not by much. So the timeline as far as piecing together the history of the Jews going back to ancient times, which is where we're going or are, is mainly contained in the Old Testament. So it's true to say that in part the Old Testament is a history, though more on that later on. That's certainly not all of what it is. And some of what's talked about in the Old Testament, I'm not saying all, some, is verifiable through other sources in Mesopotamian records of Mesopotamian kings who came in contact with the Israelites or Hebrews at one time or another. So there is some evidence allowing us to piece together Jewish history that far back, but most of it still does come from the Old Testament. The patriarch, the person who's considered to be the beginning of this sort of great pilot experiment in living sort of a life under God that the Jews come to believe is sort of the best way of life, and that they are kind of the test case, is Abraham. Patriarch means sort of the head of the whole family, the whole shebang. In chapter 23 of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, it describes, as Paul Johnson tells us, how Abraham, after the death of his wife Sarah, decided to purchase the cave of Machpelah and the lands which surround it as a burying place for her and ultimately for himself. The passage is among the most important in the entire Bible, embodying one of the most ancient and tenaciously held Jewish traditions, evidently very dear and critical to them. It is perhaps the first passage in the Bible which records an actual event, witnessed and described through a long chain of oral recitation and so for preserving authentic details. Now, Johnson's saying that this is the story is verifiable. I think that's a little bit open to question. I wouldn't state it quite as strongly as him, but I think it's likely. And if you were to read his book, he makes a persuasive argument in that direction. So Abraham basically then lays down a claim to a piece of property, which is sort of seen as the beginning of Jewish history. You probably already know at least some of the story, whether you realize it or not. And in the second book of the Old Testament comes some of its most famous events, although there's plenty in the first book as well, in Genesis. Genesis includes the creation story. Actually, there's two of them. It includes Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, and on and on. But this one, the second book of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is about the Hebrews' foray into Egypt, where they were eventually enslaved and were liberated by a guy called Moses. So yes, you probably know at least something about that story, if not more. Professor Perry, who I've quoted many times before in this class, talks about their being fearful of remaining permanent Jews, remaining fearful of being permanent slaves of the Pharaoh in Egypt. So the Hebrews yearned for an opportunity to escape. In the early 13th century BC, an extraordinary leader rose among them called Moses, leading the Hebrews in their exodus from Egypt. Moses then transformed them during their wanderings in the wilderness of Sinai into a nation, welded together and uplifted by a belief in Yahweh, the one God. So this is kind of the next step. The Hebrews sort of making their way out of slavery, out of captivity, from Egypt back into their original homeland, Palestine, which they had to, by the way, fight their way back into, which comes in the next books of the Torah, before finally controlling most of Palestine, at least for some time. And so the 12 tribes of Israel, as it worked out. So this wasn't. This is a group. Remember, these are peoples that have originally been hunter-gatherers and most likely herders for a time, pastoralists. They, at least some of them, appear to have lived in Mesopotamian societies, maybe even cities for a time as well. But the fact that they're organized into 12 tribes Right, this is going pretty far back too. You can see the dates here, so we're not surprised that tribal organization, is what we're looking at, going that far back. But the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is talked about also in the Old Testament, saw them as sort of a loosely knit group, a cultural group, and sort of worked together from at times defending themselves and so forth, but fairly loosely knit. As we know, again, hunter-gatherers were going back thousands of years. But eventually, they saw wisdom in uniting and bringing the 12 tribes together, and they elected or selected a king, Saul, as the first king. And according to Norman Cantor, my go-to historian, Saul was given divine sanction for his rule over the people by the ceremony of anointment, wherein the high priest Samuel poured holy oil on Saul's head, which became something of a tradition in the Western world, at least religiously, politically. Even though Saul came from the smallest of the Hebrew tribes, his anointment won him popularity and loyalty. So it stuck, meaning that this is a people that wasn't used to having a king, separate tribes, though related ones, but the desire, at least by some, to have a more of a top-down hierarchical system, or perceived need by some to have such a system, won out in the end, and the people, not necessarily easily, came to accept Saul and follow Saul as king. All this stuff is, again, famous from the Bible. The king following Saul was David. And yes, this is the David that's famed in the Bible for slaying Goliath. Though in the Bible, it does make it appear that Goliath is some sort of monster, and David, the underdog, sort of small guy, at least compared to a monster. It might have been a story in real life, just maybe embellished. Goliath might have been just sort of a giant, not a giant, but a large warrior like the one you see pictured on the left. And it got somewhat sort of dressed up and more dramatically presented in the Bible. So here's where we get to our first example of something that's always difficult to sort out in any religious texts from whatever religion we're talking about. And that is, it's hard to know when something, historical happened and when something is being talked about from a mythical perspective, that requires belief, or being told from a didactical perspective, an ethical perspective, to sort of make a point. Mythical perspective is another way to say it. Again, there are some things in the Old Testament that have been verified, through other sources, not just the Old Testament. But this is one of those stories that it looks like it at least got embellished for religious, mythical, ethical, didactic purposes, etc. So whoever Goliath was, the slaying of that person or enemy is one of the most seminal events in the Old Testament. David became, as Paul Johnson says, the most successful and popular king Israel ever had, the archetype of king and ruler, so that more than 2,000 years after his death, Jews saw his reign as a golden age. And so he is credited really with being the one who really united the Hebrews, particularly in being faced with the war of extinction against a group called the Philistines, one of a number of groups that they had to kind of fight with to take control back of Palestine. So David was loved for his military ability. He was supposedly a poet, and he allegedly, and it's probably true, created the capital of Israel, built the first temple in Jerusalem. So the most popular of the Hebrew kings, though there aren't many of them. And next comes the reign of Solomon. Solomon wasn't and isn't nearly as popular as David, and this is sort of the downfall of a short-lived kingdom. So the 12 tribes had united under Saul's leadership, and then stayed united and became more firmly united under David's leadership, and fused themselves into a kingdom, competing with other kingdoms in the Middle East, Near East, and by in terms of relative power, this is one of the smaller fish of kingdoms, since we already know there were some giants in the area, the Persian Empire, and so forth. So this is in some ways kind of an underdog kingdom, and it shows as we go forward. But the kingdom might have survived for longer had they had better leadership for longer. Solomon finished the temple at Jerusalem. He gets the credit for it usually. But he also, as Norman Cantor says, generated high glitz court glamour. He didn't live sort of a particularly religious life. Keep in mind, these kings were still Hebrews, Jews, so they were expected to abide by the religious principles and expectations, and Solomon didn't necessarily stick to that. Johnson again saying Solomon was a secular person, a man of this world, a man of his world and age to the bottom of his heart, if he had a heart. What Solomon became was a Near Eastern monarch of outstanding skill, but his reputation for wisdom is based on a willingness to be ruthless. So by the end of his reign, before he died, there was so much rancor and opposition within the kingdom, close to civil war, that it looked like this fairly new kingdom was going to come undone. And indeed, it actually did after his death. He was involved in many building projects, as it says on the right, which also made him unpopular because they required heavy taxation of his people, and also it made clear that he sort of had no intention of sort of living kind of the typical, religious, simple life. He lived, again, a life of high glitz and court glamour, and also just a lavish lifestyle. He had stables for hundreds of horses, and again, just lived like an ultra-rich guy. And this is the main thing that caused growing opposition to his rule. But he did die a peaceful death. It's just the kingdom was seemingly, and probably was in the works of coming unglued, and his death sort of made it even worse, since you might say, well, it got rid of a hated leader, so now the kingdom will be better off. That's certainly a possibility when something like this happens, but it doesn't always work that way. This just led to further instability, which again is not uncommon when one leader dies and they're trying to figure out what's going to come next. And part of the problem was that it wasn't entirely clear what was supposed to come next. What ended up happening is the United Kingdom of the Hebrews divided into two separate kingdoms. And this wasn't good for the long run. I don't know how much they saw that at the time. Some leaders must have, because they were already a small fish in a world of lots of big, aggressive empires around them. And by dividing, it just makes each of the kingdoms smaller. So this was not easy and predictable in what was going to happen next, with Israel falling to foreign invasion in 722 BC, and Judah, these are the names of the two separate kingdoms, in 586, and ushering in what's known, famous event in Jewish history as the Babylonian captivity, because some of them were taken, forced out of Jerusalem, out of Israel, Palestine, to Babylon, Mesopotamia, basically. Professor Perry says this time was the darkest moment in the history of the Hebrews. Their state was gone, neighboring peoples had overrun their land, and their holy temple was in ruins. Thousands had died in battle, had been executed, or had fled to Egypt and other lands, and thousands more were in exile. I almost said in Brooklyn, in Babylon. In Babylon. So this is sort of the low point in Hebrew history. And from here, and this goes all the way into the Roman period and beyond, the Jews were dispersed and eventually mostly forced out of Palestine. There was a small contingent that stayed there, but you can see from the fairly simple chart on the or map on the right that Jews sort of ended up going to southern Europe, kind of ringing the Mediterranean around Jerusalem, going sort of in both directions. And the diaspora is the word for the dispersion of Jews throughout much of the European and Western world. Eventually, that purple area there goes all the way into Western Europe, Spain, France, England, Germany, Eastern Europe, later on. And this isn't just because they were invaded once, but the Persians controlled them for a time. Again, the Mesopotamian kingdoms controlled them before that. The Romans occupied and controlled Palestine and Jews there. There were moments in that history, which I'm mostly skipping for reasons of time and simplicity, that the Jews under the reign or the rule of one foreign power, bigger power or another, were left with autonomy. So they weren't entirely free, but they were let sort of to carry on and sort of run their local government and their religious traditions basically unharmed or unmolested by the larger power. So at times they were still close to independence, but always under the thumb and potentially under duress from one of these larger powers like the Romans. So the forced immigration of the Jews over time out of Palestine, throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond into Europe, and astonishingly, with no real estate, no kingdom any longer, the Jews are able to hold their culture and their cultural identity, ethnic identity together, which they still, of course, do to this day. And eventually, as we know, got their own piece of real estate back after World War II with the creation of the modern state of Israel. Professor Perry says, in what is a marvel of history, the Hebrews survived as a people. Their faith enabled them to endure exile. So there's something to that. But I think a people who is torn from their homeland, like the Jews were, even though it happened over a long period of time in a number of different waves, since they don't have real estate any longer to hold on to, all they have are their cultural and religious traditions. So that's what they're going to focus on to keep them together. But it is still astonishing that without a homeland of their own, that this group was able to survive and in some ways thrive. And furthermore, since they're spread out, as you see in the map here, and will be even more spread out over time, it means that there are Jews sort of living in all or almost all of the European kingdoms and other places as well. But that means they're a minority group everywhere they live, and yet they still survive and endure. And part of what they survive and endure, right up until the modern world, is persecution and sort of terror visited upon them in one place after another. The covenant is another big part of Jewish history and also dealt with in the Old Testament. Abraham made a covenant with God, Yahweh, the one God, and the covenant is like a contract, of course, and it came down simply that that God would favor the Jews as his chosen ones, his chosen people, if they agreed to fully comply with his law, with his way. So his religious principles, but also his belief in how one is supposed to live their lives, to live a moral, ethical, religious life. So if the Jews follow this God loyally, he singles them out, or promises to single them out as his chosen people. And of course, they accept. In some ways, you could say they had no choice. As Cantor said, they had no choice but to maintain God's covenant. This was their burden and their glory. The covenant idea is the polar opposite of democracy, multiculturalism, and ethnic equality. It is intensely elitist, and that is true. But I think I would stop short of Cantor's more extreme statement there. It's partially true, for certain. But the Jews, in a sense, here are, yes, in some ways, probably arrogant about this, thinking, God singled us out. They're, by the way, not the last people to claim to be the chosen people of God, by the way. I'm sure you figured out by now. They're the first, at least sort of on the grand stage of history. But I think this is also, as even Cantor himself says here, a burden to them, because they're kind of like the guinea pigs. They're the test case for this. God is sort of trying this new way of living, this new way of worshiping, this new way of leading a religious life, he's having them do it, as kind of an experiment in a sense. So this wasn't necessarily easy, not necessarily even wanted. And from the beginning, though this is not always seen as so by all scholars, but really from the beginning, this religion was universalizable, meaning that, again, if God was using the Hebrews as his kind of test case for this type of religion, this type of lifestyle, this type of way of life, set of values, then that implies that it could be, if it worked, that it could be and probably would be spread. It's often presented, Jewish history and religion, as a closed religion just between the one God and the Jews, and that they saw themselves as holding on tightly and avoiding penetration by any outsiders into their religion. And that was certainly true of some leaders and some of the early Hebrews, but not all. And I don't think that's the correct definition in terms of its overall influence in world history. The Hebrew scriptures, again, the Old Testament, and this all gets extremely confusing. There are 39 books of the Old Testament. If you're super religious as a Christian, or maybe practicing Jew yourself, maybe you know all this, and I'm not requiring you to memorize any of these. I'm just showing you the complexity of the Old Testament. But it is the first 5 books, the Torah, that are the most famous: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's in those that the laws or rules, they're not law necessarily in the legal sense, but they're kind of like that. They're certainly a moral code and the key to sort of the new way that God is requiring them to live and worship, in the world as kind of his experiment. We see certain values come out of this, and the 7 I've listed here, I want to be clear, they weren't necessarily, all of them, the Hebrew or Jewish values at the time. To some degree they were, in some cases more than others, but what I'm mainly getting out here, or trying to get at here, is to show you how much of an influence this has going forward, particularly on Europe. So these are, when it says values in time, it means the 7 that you see below, numbered, are eventually values that Europeans, Jewish and Christian, come to hold on a widespread basis. It becomes deeply entrenched in European culture and society. Again, the Judeo-Christian element in European culture. Ethical monotheism means not only is there one God, monotheism means one God, but this God is ethical, meaning that this God is just and deals justly with human beings, and he's ethical and moral, but he expects ethical and moral behavior out of his chosen people. So one of the part of the deal is you better behave ethically, and he lays out a system of ethics. If you believe the Old Testament is God laying out, or you can conceive of that possibility. May or may not be true, but that this is what's coming out of it. So now you think, well, aren't all gods, whoever God we're talking about, whether it's one God or multiple gods, don't they all expect or require ethical behavior? No, they don't. Not necessarily. The Greek gods and goddesses were notorious for not giving a fig about human beings and behaving themselves in the most atrocious and unethical manner, the most immoral and amoral behavior you could think of. So, there are some scholars today that wonder that if the Judeo-Christian tradition hadn't come along to fuse with the Greco-Roman, whether European society could have achieved all the things that it sort of did into the modern world up until the present. And many of them say no, that if the Greek gods had prevailed and gone forward, into, say, Rome and Europe in the Middle Ages and beyond, because there wasn't a Hebrew tradition, never been a Hebrew group that at least became powerful, and so no Christianity, no Jesus, then at least some scholars believe that with those gods, they could have never achieved what they did, because there just wasn't enough sort of moral and ethical cement foundation to lay down in order to achieve things scientifically, intellectually, politically, economically, and otherwise. Freedom of choice is in here, which eventually leads to liberty in Europe. Freedom of choice in that in this system of ethical monotheism, God, is giving you the opportunity to follow him. You can choose not to. Now, you're going to pay a steep price if you choose not to, but nonetheless, it's on you. So you have freedom of choice, and this also is about not just the concept of liberty, but another concept that has has had a long shelf life in European history, in the Western world, and the world as a whole, though it's still debated, and that is free will. So this religion set Europe down the path of largely believing in free will and liberty, though not there are dissenters in Europe. Equality, that stems from the belief that all are equal in God's eyes, at least from a religious perspective. It's not saying that all people have equal rights. That's a modern concept. So this is way before that. It's not saying that all people have equal ability. It's saying they're equal in God's eyes. Nonetheless, just the thought of anybody being equal for, in whatever way, is a step in the direction of those other types of equality and more. The Jews or Hebrews believed in historical time. They actually helped sort of lay down the part of the West's value system that saw time and history kind of unfolding chronologically on a timetable, and that there was sort of a directionality to history. The idea of progress sort of seeps into the picture here a bit as well, particularly when we will see Judaism's influence on Christianity. Social justice, the Torah is rife with the books telling the Jewish people, the Hebrew tribes, the kingdom, to be kind and be generous to the downtrodden and the poor, the struggling, the suffering, all kinds of injunctions and directives. Just to pick one off the top of my head, there's one section, I forget which book it's in, but it says, tells owners of say farms, orchards, say apple trees or whatever, and it instructs them, any of your fruit that you pick and put in your basket, those are yours, it's your property, but any that fall to the ground, like in the middle of the night, that you don't pick, you're supposed to leave those for the poor, the homeless, the underprivileged. So there is this isn't social justice in the way the phrase is used today. Again, that's quite modern and something new, but social justice in the sense of great concern for the poor, and it's sort of in the ethical religious code here laid down in the Old Testament that you are duty bound to sort of help those less fortunate than yourself. Again, we talked about already the universalizability of this. So it was seen as potentially universal, which does mean, yes, that the Jews and then the Christians believe not only that their religion is potentially universal, but it means their God is in their minds, is the only God, or at least the only legitimate God, the only real God, which has been seen by some today, and for some time now, as arrogant elitists. Even Norman Cantor, who we've been quoting, thinks so himself. Lastly, individualism. There is a real concern for the individual, which does connect, of course, to freedom of choice and liberty, but the Jewish system, religious system here, ethical system, does lay out a way of life that leads to focus on individuals' rights, at least in time. Paul Johnson, again, in his great one-volume treatment of this people, says that no people has ever insisted more firmly than the Jews that history has a purpose and humanity a destiny. At a very early stage in their collective existence, they believed they had detected a divine scheme for the human race, of which their own society was to be the pilot. The Jews stand right at the center of the perennial attempt to give human life the dignity of a purpose. I already read that, but I like it so much, and it should stick in your brain. Go back and study this, not necessarily on both slides, but on one of them. So the idea of a life having a purpose, I think, really is sort of baked in to this religious system as it is in Christianity, as again, because they're related in part. I'm not saying other religions don't have that in there as well, but it's I think pretty clear, even from some of the 7 values that emerge from this in Europe, that this is part of a big part of even the appeal of the religion. The Mosaic Law, as it's known, right, coming from Moses, part of the story in Exodus, the 2nd book, when Moses leads the Hebrews out of captivity as slaves in Egypt, back towards Palestine. They wander in the Sinai Peninsula for a while, and Moses sort of leaves for a while, and God throws the 10 Commandments at him, and they've come down as, I don't think this is actually written in the Torah, at least not in Exodus, but it's come to be sort of laid out this way visually, as if there were 2 tablets, 5 commandments on each one. So the 10 Commandments, of course, are by far the most famous of the laws, or at least the directives, ethical directives of God to the Hebrews. But there are actually as many as 613. You see at the bottom of the screen, I put a question mark after that just because that's a count that I read, I think, in Paul Johnson's book, but there might be others that have come up with a different number. it's not as easy to count as you might think, because sometimes in one uh, command, there's two or three things being commanded, and it's hard to say, is that one command or is that three? So another reason for the question mark. He also says, same guy, same book, I don't mean Moses or God, I mean Paul Johnson, there's no distinction between the religious and secular, all are one, or between civil, criminal, and moral law. In Mosaic legal theory, all breaches of the law offend God. All crimes are sins, just as all sins are crimes. So, again, I think that's somewhat of a matter of interpretation. I would lean a little less heavily on that sort of being exactly true. I don't think the commandments are law in the same sense we think of law today, but they're not that far away. They're at least a move in that direction. And the Ten Commandments offend a lot of people today that aren't Christians, or at least not practicing Christians, wear the religion more lightly. And I'm not taking sides in this at all. I'm trying to present things from all sides. But you can make a good case, and plenty of scholars do, Paul Johnson among them, that these 10 commandments, and again there are others that follow, but this is kind of the main foundation of what follows. That this sets things up for a pretty good life. I don't mean necessarily good in the sense of fun all the time, although I don't mean lack of fun either, but good in the sense of flourishing life, good in the sense of, again, a meaningful life. So that if you, I'm sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry, I had something to attend to there. So that if you were to follow these, some of you do, or try to, it sets you up for a pretty good life. And some of them, if you haven't studied the Bible, and I'm forgiving you here if you have not, I have, not intensely, but I have. And some of these are more profound than they even look. And there's, I think, more human psychology behind this than might be thought. So I would argue that these are not just pronouncements that are required religiously because God says so, and that it'll keep you on the sort of straight and narrow moral path, that too, but that it also that it sort of penetrates sort of deeply into human nature and sort of keeps you on the right path psychologically, morally, ethically as well, and teaches you in a sense sort of how to, the Ten Commandments, the overall Hebrew tradition, sort of how to live the good life, right? How to live a meaningful life, as Aristotle had said it, right? A life of human flourishing. Lastly come the Hebrew prophets, lastly with regard to the Hebrews, and they do come a little bit later on the timeline, as you can see here. One scholar that I like has claimed that these are sort of the first intellectual rebels in history. I put a question mark on that because it's arguable, but among them, the most famous, Elijah, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, who get books of the Old Testament that they apparently wrote, though professors in various divinity schools and the biblical criticism, textual criticism that's gone on since the 19th century, kind of taking the Bible apart with a fine-tooth comb, does sort of question, still even now, it's not always clear who wrote what and when. For instance, the book of Isaiah, it's sometimes thought by some such scholars that Isaiah wrote one part of it, and somebody else, a follower of his, after his death, wrote another part of it. And some even believe that there was a third generation follower of Isaiah that wrote like a third of it, like a third, and a third. But it's not entirely clear. Norman Cantor, the prophets did not advocate simply a return to the practices and way of life of earlier times. They were progressives who demanded fulfillment of morality, social justice, and the pure worship of Yahweh. To save the nation, it would be necessary to purify national life and reform society. These guys are right. They come around the time, most of them, at the fall of Israel and the fall of Judah, the two separate kingdoms. So it was a time of crisis for the most part for the Jewish people, and the prophets sort of wave a warning finger, saying, if we don't, this is all happening to us because of us displeasing God, and if we don't sort of mend our ways and follow God's law as we promised we would in the covenant, we'll be punished for it, and things will get worse. So Jeremiah is one of those who sort of sings out these shrill warnings to his people. In fact, we have a word in our language today, a Jeremiad. If someone delivers a Jeremiad, it's this kind of stern, shrill warning about something, dressing somebody or a group of people down for something. So Jeremiah issued Jeremiads, but so did the other prophets that you see here as well. But this again gets back to the deep concern in this religion for living a good life, which very much includes living according to an ethical code, ethical monotheism.